Yes, thank you. I will point out that in the back, we do have items out there for you to pick up, a trifold brochure that we published. And just also wanted to let you know that my work has been done in association with Mark Antonacci. I've only been working on this project for 6 years. He's been working on it for 38 years. He wrote a book on the Shroud of Turin in 2000. The title was The Resurrection of the Shroud. And then in 2015, he wrote this book, 500-page book, Test the Shroud. The purpose of this book was to try and encourage additional testing on the Shroud of Turin. And there has been significant progress on that even this year. Now, as I get into this project, I will let you know that, first of all, the young people are probably not familiar with the Shroud of Turin. And that's because of the history behind it. But it has been on the cover of Time magazine. It has been on the cover of U.S. News and World Report. A few years ago, I bought the book 100 Greatest Mysteries, and it had one full page on the Shroud of Turin, being included as one of the greatest mysteries in the world. Probably the high point for the media, though, was the June issue in 1980 of National Geographic, where they had a 4-page fold-out displaying the Shroud of Turin and discussing it. So after the carbon dating that was done in 1988, publicity on the Shroud of Turin has fallen off dramatically, as well as funding and research. But there is a resurgence of research on it now and increasing funding of that research. So the title today is Holistic Solution to the Mysteries of the Shroud of Turin. The mysteries of the Shroud of Turin would include the image, the dating, and the blood, those 3 areas. And they can all be broken down into sub-issues. Holistic refers to one solution that encompasses everything. And that's the beauty of the concept that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight. And this is basically the same presentation that I gave at the International Shroud Conference that was held this last August 14th to 17th in Ancaster, Canada, just southwest of Toronto. That was about a 2.5-day conference. And I presented this with good receptivity. Now, let's go over just quickly an outline. I have a lot of material to cover, so we're going to be covering lots of this briefly. So we're going to do an introduction, then a brief history on the Shroud, and then what is the Shroud, history of the research on the Shroud, including the first photo, the first 8 decades of research, STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project in 1978, and then the radiation hypothesis solving the various mysteries of the Shroud of Turin. Now, my background, I've earned a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan, graduating in 1971. Spent 38 years in the nuclear industry doing all sorts, primarily doing calculations, computer calculations on nuclear reactor design, criticality, safety, and statistical analysis of measurements. And most of that has been applicable to this current project on the Shroud of Turin. I also organized the International Conference on the Shroud of Turin in 2017. I, with my wife and daughter, organized this. It was a 4-day conference. We had 28 researchers from around the world, including Italy, Spain, France, Mexico, Australia, and the United States. We put together 34 hours of PowerPoint presentations and panel discussions. It's all available on my website, shroudresearch.net. Pick up my business card in the back with that information on it. Also organized the Shroud Research Network. This is a group of about 10 individuals that are working with me in Richland, Washington. Richland is one of the premier nuclear sites in the country, because just north of us is the Hanford nuclear site, about 580 square miles dedicated to nuclear research. And on my website of shroudresearch.net, I have 23 papers that we've published so far, and they're all available on that site. Now this is the picture of our Shroud Research Network that we have in the Richland area. Richland is part of what they call Tri-Cities, Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco. in Washington. We drove over this morning. It took us 6 hours to get here with a little bit of slowing down with traffic on Highway 5. But this was taken a year ago in October. And I'm seated with the blue tie on, similar to this tie. On my left is Mark Antonacci, author of this book. Now, the goals and the methods that we have for our group, our goal is very simply stated to solve the mysteries of the Shroud. It's not to prove one thing or another. We're trying to do good science using the scientific method. Now, what that means, we have 4 different components to the scientific method in this. We determine what is true about the Shroud. That's where we start. Then we develop a concept or a hypothesis to explain what is true. In other words, the concept has to be consistent with what's true. If it's not consistent with what's true, it can't be true. And then we use the hypothesis to make predictions. And we are into that phase now. And this coming year, we're going into the phase of testing those predictions. So we're going to be we're attempting to solve the mysteries of the Shroud using the scientific method, following the evidence where it leads. Now, that's an important aspect. And it's important because the objective individual has to dissociate himself from presuppositions. And that's a difficult thing to do. So we're going to follow the evidence where it leads. In other words, we're going to try and have a neutral mindset without presuppositions. Now, whether you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever religion you are, you would have certain presuppositions that in this methodology, you have to dissociate yourselves from that belief system. For example, we have to dissociate ourselves from religious and naturalistic presuppositions. Religious presuppositions, we have to say that maybe the Shroud's authentic and maybe it's not. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. Maybe Jesus was raised from the dead, maybe he wasn't. And maybe a unique event happened, and maybe it didn't, that was outside of our understanding of physics. So we have to take a neutral mindset in all those things. If you want to get further into naturalism, then look at my paper 19. Go to my website, shroudresearch.net. Go to the research page, go to paper 19, look at section 3. That's where I go into more detail on naturalism. Now this is a rather approximate map of the history of the Shroud of Turin. Now, I should say that Turin is up in the northwestern corner of Italy. The Shroud has been in Turin since 1578, except for a short period during World War II when it was evacuated to a secret location. It arrived, it was up in Lorraine, France, and displayed as the burial cloth of Jesus in 1355 or 1356. We do have a continuous history from that point in 1355 or 56 until it arrived in Turin, Italy. It was in a fire in Chambry, France, located about there. Now, the dash line here indicates that we really don't know the route. So sometimes people say that the Shroud of Turin can only be traced back to 1355 or so. That's true for the continuous history. But you have to realize that there are locations where we have good evidence that it was also located in Constantinople. And we'll get into that. We believe that it started in Jerusalem, based again upon the scientific evidence that there was a small chip of limestone found down near the feet that was identified based upon the impurities as Jerusalem limestone. It's not found a few other places in the world, but primarily in Jerusalem. There were also pollens that were found on the Shroud of Turin that were unique to the Jerusalem area. So therefore, there's good evidence that it was in Jerusalem. There's also DNA found from the Jerusalem area. And then when the Christians evacuated prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, based upon the evidence, they primarily went down to Antioch, down on the Mediterranean coast, so that it could very well be that the Shroud of Turin was taken down to Antioch at that point, though we don't have any historical evidence specifically to what we call the Shroud of Turin today. Now, you have to realize that when we call it the Shroud of Turin, it's only been called that since it came into Turin. So when it was up in Chambéry, France, it would be the image of Chambéry, or the image of Lorey. Down in Constantinople, it would be called the Mendelian, or the image of God incarnate. Different names for different locations. So over in Edessa, we believe it was the image of Edessa, for example. So that's part of the problem in doing historical research on this. Okay. So that the evidence that it was down in Constantinople, there's several different evidences actually, but the primary evidence is what's called the pre-manuscript, or codex. Codex is just a word that refers to something that's bound like a book. And it was discovered by a man named Prey. It's the oldest manuscript in the Hungarian language in the library in Budapest, I believe. So this is actually just one of the pages in that manuscript, and just the bottom section of this page, which is a colored diagram. And so that we see an angel here, 3 women over here. We see here what we would call the Jesus burial cloth. There are several indications of that. It's not any kind of a stone box that he was buried in. Some people say this. Hard to believe how they'd say that. There's no three-dimensionality to this. This is extremely thin. There's just no evidence of a three-dimensionality to this item. It shows the blood of Jesus here in orange or red crosses on the lower piece. On the upper piece, it has this stair-step pattern. Do you see that? Here and here. This is indicative of the 3-to-1 herringbone weave that the Shroud of Turin is made out of. And thus, this stair-step pattern indicates that it is what we call the Shroud of Turin today. But primarily, do you see this whole pattern right here? 1, 2, 3, right angle turn, 4. Do you see that pattern of little circles? Very unusual. Why would you put that onto a diagram like this? Because he had seen, evidently, when he went to Constantinople, he had evidently seen it, or at least maybe heard evidence of it. Those holes in that pattern are also on the Shroud of Turin. So that this, even though it's dated to 1192 to 1195, 65 years before the carbon dating, this proves that it was in Constantinople and disproves the carbon dating. We have historical evidence that contradicts the carbon dating, and there's much evidence like that. So this is where it's located today, in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And this picture was taken, I believe it was 1978 when it went on display. After the exhibit, that's when the Shroud of Turin Research Project came in, and we're given 5 days, 24 hours a day to do research on the Shroud. But this picture shows it on exhibit for the several weeks that they usually put it on exhibit. And about 2.5 to 3 million people filed past it and saw the image that's on it at that point. So it's a real item. People can see it. It goes on display just a few times a century. It was on display in 2015 from April 19th to June 26th. We hear rumors that it's going to be going on display again in 2025. It usually goes on display in commemoration of some important events. It went on display in 1978 as the 400th birthday of it being present in Turin. Now, when you go to see it, if you were to do so, they usually show it under very dim light, and you're looking at it maybe through 1.5 inches of glass or plastic, as the case may be. So it's rather difficult to see. You actually see it better under a photograph. But the upper picture here shows something like you would see it at the cathedral, with the image being very dim. The front image from the head down to the feet, and the back image from the head down to the feet, so that it's a head-to-head image. Look at my 1/3 size replica of the Shroud out here, and you can see why. Because they didn't wrap it like an Egyptian mummy. They wrapped it up over the head and then down the front, so that it formed a front and back image. Now, when it was in Chambéry, France, 1532, The church caught on fire. They ran in to save what they regarded as one of the most important relics of Christianity. Were able to pull out the silver box that it was housed in. It appears as though one corner had melted, dripped down onto the folded shroud, burned through one corner, and scorched one edge. When they unfolded it, this was the pattern of scorches that they obtained on one side and on the other. And you can see the patches that were needed. 4 patches, 4 patches, 4 patches, 4 patches that had to be put on where the material had fully carbonized. Okay? Fortunately, the image was largely unhurt. Just over here at the elbows is where it was damaged, so that we can actually see it a little bit clearer in the negative. That would be this. Now it appears as though it's a positive, but it appears as a positive only because on the image it's actually a negative. And we'll tell you more about that. Now, this was a famous painting that was made in the mid-1500s. Just wanted to show you this, for this was how it was wrapped up over the head and then down to the feet. So that the front image, on the front image, now the purpose, I'm going to show you the front image and the back image. The main takeaway here is that what we see on the Shroud of Turin is identical to the description of how Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. There's no difference. This is identical. For example, up at the top, we have real blood running down from puncture wounds. On the side, we have the side wound with a hole in the skin, elliptical hole just the size of a Roman thrusting spear, with post-mortem blood running down where it's post-mortem after death because the red blood cells had separated out of the clear blood serum, so that as the spear thrust came in, out first ran the red blood corpuscles, and then out ran the clear blood serum, could be easily called water. So that you see the blood running down with the correct angles on the arms. At the wrist, it's very interesting that all the paintings from the Middle Ages have the nails going through the middle of the palms, because the Bible says that the nails were put into his hands, not realizing that in Jewish culture, the hand goes down to about here. So that when experiments were done with a cadaver, they found that nails through here only supported 62 pounds. Wouldn't support a man of about 170 to 175 pounds, 5'10" approximately. So that the wounds were not in the palms. They would have gone through here. Interesting, there's one point in the wrist here where if the nail's put through there, it won't break any bones at all. It'll just spread them out, the little bones in the wrist. But in doing so, what they didn't know in the Middle Ages, the paintings all show the thumbs very prominently. When the nail goes through the wrist, it automatically folds the thumbs over because it crushes the nerve that collects all the feelings from the hand. Can you imagine the amount of pain that was involved in that? The Shroud of Turin didn't follow the custom of the paintings in the Middle Ages. The Shroud of Turin gets it right. No thumbs. That's one of the many evidences that this was not done during the carbon date of 1260 to 1390. Let's see what else we have. We have scourge marks all the way down. We have the feet, actually 2 holes. We'll see a little bit clearer on the back image. We have abrasions on one knee and the tip of the nose, and those abrasions have dirt in them. Let's see what else. Okay, let's go to the back image. Back or dorsal image. Again, we have the blood running down from the scalp. It's interesting that experts on blood can actually tell whether blood coming out of a wound is blood coming from arteries or veins. And the blood shown on the Shroud of Turin is correct. The blood that's coming out of arteries are over arteries. The blood that's coming out of veins are over veins. Gets it right. Across the shoulders, we have abrasions across both shoulders. Scourge marks coming all the way down. The blood from the side wound was seeping out of the wound while this person was laying on the cloth, and it ran across the small of his back, scourge marks all the way down. You can see one hole in his heel and one in his foot at this point. You notice this foot bends. Can you see that? This foot also bends. So in other words, they put one nail through the foot, then they forced one foot over the other and put one nail through both. The reason being that would allow the one foot with only one nail to rotate so that he could push up and down on the cross in order not to suffocate. In the down position, his rib cage would be expanded. He couldn't get air in. He has to push up to get air in. They were experts on maximizing pain. Okay. Okay. Now, this is the picture, a close-up picture of the fibers. Now, I want you to look at that and tell me what image you see there. Do you see an image? Of Turin, if you get close, you don't see the image. You have to get back 8 or 10 feet to see the image. Isn't that fascinating? So in other words, if this were a painted item, it would have to be done by an artist with a 10-foot-long paintbrush. Wow. So anyway, what you see here, this is what's causing the image. These fibers have been discolored with a straw yellow or sepia color. And it's just the top 1 or 2 layers of fibers that are so discolored. Now you notice, it's discolored here, it's discolored here, but it's not discolored here, it's not discolored here. So the discoloration on the fibers is modeled. All that has to be explained. Any theory you come up to explain, the image on the shroud has to explain not only why we have discoloration on only the top 2 layers, but also the modeling of the discoloration on the fibers. And so that's what we've tried to do. We've followed the evidence where it leads. In other words, we're trying to do forensic research, essentially reverse engineering. Those are terms for what we're trying to do. Okay? Okay, there we go. That first picture was taken by Secondo Pia in 1898. His camera is still on display in the museum in Turin, Italy, in the museum of the shroud there. Now, it's interesting. 1898, he goes in. Everyone believes it's a painting at that point. So he goes in, his hobby's photography, takes the first picture, takes the big glass plate into his dark room, takes it out of the camera, puts it in the fixture he's developing. Now, on the image, if you just looked at it with your eye, it's a very low contrast image. So he knows that on his film that he's developing, it should be a negative. So he was expecting a low resolution negative image. As it's coming up, probably under red light, he raises it up, and he's shocked to find a high resolution positive image. And what does that mean? Well, that means that on the shroud itself, it's a negative image. Now, what does that mean? A negative image can't be painted by a painter, especially in 1898. He had no concept of what a negative was, had never seen a negative. An artist couldn't paint such a thing. He'd never seen one. So that was the evidence that it wasn't a painting, which disproved everyone's concept of this. They all accused him of being a liar and using fakery on his photograph. They wouldn't believe it. A few did. A few did. We'll get into that. So if it's not made by the artist, and if they couldn't think of any way to forge it, then what does that mean? It was made by the body. Okay? You see where we're going with this? Just keep that thought. Now there's something interesting here about the nose, the image on the nose. On the nose, the cloth would have been touching the nose, but it would not have been touching beside the nose. Yet on the image, we see the nose dark in a negative image, but it doesn't just, the image doesn't cease to exist down the nostrils. No, it's a smooth gradation down the nostrils, even where the cloth wasn't touching, would not have been touching. What does that mean? Well, that means something very important. It means that the image was not made by contact with the shroud. It was made by something passing across the gap between the body and the shroud. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, as it comes further down the nostril and further away from the cloth, it gets lighter and lighter. What does that mean? We're just following the evidence where it leads. What does that mean? It means that the greater the vertical distance between the body and the cloth, the more, whatever it is diminished. So something coming from the body to create the discoloration on the cloth that's traveling vertically from the body to the cloth, which decreases as that distance increases. Now, my background is nuclear engineering. And so immediately, there we go. Immediately, I think that's a perfect explanation of radiation. That's my immediate thought. Radiation, as it would pass through air, would diminish due to absorption or scattering, and possibly even decay. So my initial thought here, upon realizing this, is that we're dealing with radiation, because that's what the evidence indicates. Okay, so smooth gradation of coloration, not due to contact. Something flowed from the body to the cloth to form the image. So again, this again would indicate if we have something flowing from the body to the cloth to form the image, the body has to be there, has to be related in some sense to the formation of the image. Now, I like this, Yves Delage. Isn't that a beautiful name? You can say that over and over at night as you go to sleep. Yves Delage. He was the very famous scientist, by the way. He was the discoverer of the functions of the inner ear. Agnostic or atheist, a very prominent member of the scientific institution in Paris. So he got interested in the Shroud of Turin after Segunda Pia took the first photograph, and he went and he spent about 2 years with his assistant investigating it. He went in to this very prestigious institution, and he announced that it is the burial cloth of Jesus. And they were astounded, they were aghast, so much so that they refused to document his presentation, even though it was the best attended presentation since Lister had spoken. Interesting. His conclusion was that there's only 1 in 10 billion chance it is not authentic. The first investigator of the Shroud of Turin. Now, this goes through the investigators over the first 8 decades of research. We have Yves Delage and his assistant Paul Vignan. Look at Paul Vignan, 44 years of investigating the Shroud of Turin. Isn't that amazing? Some of these even spent 5 decades examining. Notice they're all have their doctorate degrees, professors, medical doctors. Some of them were surgeons under war conditions, where they'd be very familiar with wounds and blood. So these were the individuals who, their basic thing that they were investigating was the nature of the blood. Because it was so weird, so strange. It looked like it was the shroud itself that was bleeding. Yet how could that be? It was the body that was bleeding. Very strange. So their conclusion, let's go on to it here. So the characteristics of the blood marks. First of all, the pristine edges. They found pristine edges, like the cloth itself was bleeding. There was no cracking or flaking of anything on the shroud itself. Now, if you have a wound on your hand, and let's say if you wait for 2 hours, put a cloth down on it, there's not going to be any blood transferred. It doesn't soak in. Dried blood doesn't soak into a cloth. If you put the cloth on while it's wet and leave it for 2 hours and then take it off, everything cracks and breaks. I've tried it. Okay? You don't get what you see on the Shroud of Turin, and that's what they were struggling with. And so they concluded that there must have been a human body that had died by crucifixion that was wrapped in the shroud in order to create the evidence on the shroud. They were following the evidence where it leads. Okay? Instead of depending on their presuppositions. Okay? So that not only the pristine edges, but also the depressed centers and the raised edges of where the blood had coagulated. There's a certain shape to real blood when it coagulates. And then there's also the presence on the shroud of serum halo rings that were only visible under ultraviolet light. I doubt if a forger would know to do that in 1356 or whenever. Okay? Wouldn't know to do that. The conclusion, the blood came from a body that was wrapped in the shroud, not due to an artist or forger. Okay, now, this is Dr. John Jackson, physicist working at that point at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And he was looking at the shroud and thinking about investigating it. Someone sent him an electronic device called a friend actually sent him an electronic device called a VP8 image analyzer. And so he took the face of Jesus, he took the face from the Shroud of Turin and put it onto the viewing area of the VP8 image analyzer. And up on the oscilloscope screen came what appeared to be a three-dimensional image of the face. Now that was fascinating because there is no three-dimensional information in either photographs or paintings. It doesn't exist. Yet there is three-dimensional information in the image on the Shroud of Turin. How is that possible? And how do you create that? Okay? Now that's just part of the mysteries here that I think we have a solution to. That would actually be created automatically by radiation coming from the body if, as it makes the transition across that vertical distance between the body and the shroud, if it's diminishing due to absorption, scattering, or possibly decay. In the process of diminishing, it would register, the further the distance through the air, it would register a weaker signal, thus encoding the information that defines the vertical distance between the body and the cloth, which is what the three-dimensional information on the Shroud of Turin is. Wow. So he let it be known amongst his friends and others that of this amazing thing, three-dimensional information on a two-dimensional piece of cloth that's been in Turin, Italy since 1578. How can that be? So he gathered together a team of people and $2.5 million worth of equipment. And in 1978, the Vatican allowed them to go to the Shroud of Turin, to the cathedral in Turin, Italy. And they spent 5 days, 24 hours a day. They worked in 3 shifts. They slept in the room where they had a whole sequence of experiments. First experiment, half the group said, well, it's obviously painting. It has to be painting. And so they said, okay, well, you take the first half hour. So that was simple. They just come up to it with high-powered microscopes. Is there pigment there or not? So in the first half hour, they said, well, there's no pigment there. Can't be a painting. So the next half hour, they said, well, it looks like a scorch. Has a coloration of a scorch. Maybe it's a scorch. So they said, well, simple experiment for that. They turned off all the lights, came in with a black light, and ran it over the shroud. All of the scorch marks along the side fluoresced, but the image did not. So it's not a scorch from a hot object, at least. Now, there is such a thing as a cold scorch from radiation. As you go out on not a hot day, just a cool day, you can still get a sunburn. That's a cold scorch. Okay? So, now the experiments, the conclusions here. Let's read down through the conclusions of their experiments. No pigment, no carrier, no brush strokes, no clumping of fibers or threads, no capillarity. Now that means soaking up of a liquid, so that there was no liquid involved in the formation of the image, no capillarity, no stiffening of the cloth, no cracking of the image along fold lines. Now all of those would be present if it was due to paint, dye, or stain. But none of them were present. So go with the evidence. It's not due to paint, dye, or stain. Also, there's no body decay products detected. So that rules out any interaction between body decay products and any possible ointments put onto the body. Their conclusion, the image is not due to paint, dye, or stain. Liquid scorch, body decay. It's also not a photographic process. Now, that needs a little bit further explanation. A lot of different factors here. We can just due to maybe time constraints, we can just hit on a couple of them. I've already mentioned three-dimensional information. Photographs don't have three-dimensional information in them because it's a two-dimensional object. There's extreme superficiality. The discoloration itself, we'll get into that. But most amazingly, what causes the discoloration? Let's hold off. We'll get into that a little bit later. No capillarity. Most photographic processes involve liquids in some way. The fiber discoloration is modeled. We have an explanation for that based upon radiation. There's no residual materials from a photographic process on the shroud. In other words, many people have tried to put together an hypothesis that depends on photography. But you realize, in order for it to be true, it has to agree with both the macroscopic evidence, that's just as you look at it, does it look like, in every respect, like the shroud? As well as some microscopic characteristics. That is, when you take a very close look at it with a light microscope and even with an electron microscope, is it the same? And there's been no hypothesis consistent with all of the evidence. In addition to that, of course, it was first shown up in Lorey, France in 1355, yet the first photograph was in 1826. So how does that allow it to be a photograph? Isn't that interesting? So let's go on. Now, this is a diagram that I've made. A typical thread could have 200 or more fibers in it. A linen fiber. Linen is made out of the flax plant. Grows about so high. They harvest it, let it rot to decay the outer material from the long stems. Then they take the long fibers from the center of the stems and weave that into thread to make into a fabric. And so what I've pictured here is just 150. But you see, I don't know if you can see under this lighting, the top two layers of fibers here are slightly discolored. Can you see that or not? I'll just tell you that they are. Okay, but you can also see there's nothing clumping in between those fibers. Now, if this was due to paint, there'd be something clumping the fibers together. The threads would also be clumped together, on and on. Okay. And you see no capillarity. In other words, it's just the top two layers. Yeah, you don't have any bleeding from one fiber into the next. There's no capillarity taking place. So there's no liquid involved here. So that once they, in the Shroud of Turin research project, in their investigation, after 1978, they found that the discoloration was just on the top one or two layers of fibers. And then they said, well, where on those fibers is the discoloration located? So they're just trying to investigate in every way that they can. Now, a fiber, linen fiber, is about 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. It's 15 microns in diameter. A micron is a millionth of a meter, about 1,000th of a millimeter. A millimeter is 1/10 of a centimeter, if that helps you. 2.5 centimeters per inch. 2.54. I have to be accurate to be loyal to my engineering background. 2.54. But what we have here is the discoloration is all the way around the outer circumference of the fiber, and it's less than 0.4 microns thick. 0.4 microns thick, with the inside of the fiber not discolored. How do you do that? So that's always the question that comes up. Whatever the correct explanation is, has to explain these features. So, following the evidence, where it leads, we have a negative image. What does that mean? It's not made by an eye. We have a smooth gradation of coloration. That means it's not due to contact of the cloth. It means that something flowed from the body. Now, another feature here is that in the weave, the upper fibers that may be discolored, if they are, over a lower fiber, the lower fiber can be discolored except where it was covered by the upper fiber. In other words, the shielding. That also indicates the image contains three-dimensional information. There's three things that are needed to form that image. You need a discoloration mechanism that can discolor the fibers. But that's not adequate in itself. You need energy to drive it. Every mechanism needs energy. And in this particular case, the energy is involved in actually rearranging the atomic structure in the cellulose. And I'll get into that in a minute. To actually form the discoloration. So the third item, besides having a discoloration mechanism and energy to drive it, you need to have information to control it. If you don't have information to control these items here, lights. Well, I prefer the word photon emitters, if that's okay. These photon emitters, light, the smallest packet of light is called a photon. And so these photon emitters are emitting photons throughout our room. And so that, for example, why can you see me, why can I see you? You ever think about that? Well, you open your eyes and there's light in the room, you see. But, you know, let's go a little bit deeper. What's going on here? Well, when I look at you, what's happening is these photons are bouncing off you in all directions. Some of them go into my eyes. And those photons carry the information that defines your appearance, so that that information is deposited on the back of my eyes, on the rods and cones. That's transferred, that information is then transferred into electrical energy that goes up the optic nerve to my brain, where my brain has learned to recognize those electrical signals as the information that defines a person's appearance. That's what's going on when you see someone. In other words, it all relates to information. You look out in the scene in front of you, everything is based on information coming to you based upon photons carrying the information to you. The colors that I see are transferred on the energy of the photons. The shade, light versus dark, is carried on the number of photons. The location of any particular color and shade, like from this point, the position of that is determined by the angle that that photon goes through the lens of my eye and on the rod or cone that it hits. So all that information is being transferred by photons. And what are photons? Radiation. Radiation has almost been ideally, you might say, it seems like radiation has been ideally designed to carry information. Now that is true for photons of light, ultraviolet light, and infrared radiation. It's also true for particles having mass, such as electrons or protons. So any of those types of radiation would do. To carry the information defining the appearance of the body from the body to the cloth. Now, sometimes people say, well, yeah, I realize the image was created by radiation, but maybe there was an earthquake or a lightning strike nearby creating radiation from the limestone. That's not going to work. Why is that? Because the information that defined the appearance of a naked, crucified man was not in the limestone. Okay? It was not in the air. Where was that information? It was inherent to the body. Did you have a question in the back?
Yes. Radiation, you're talking radiation. Did the cloth have any radioactive above background?
Okay, what was the cloth exposed to any radiation above background? No, I've never been given that opportunity. Oh, okay, so the question is, has the Shroud of Turin been tested for radiation? No, it has not been. That's why we need another round of testing of the Shroud of Turin. Okay? And that's what we're trying to obtain. So what we're saying is that the radiation came from the body. It would have included, we think the image was formed by particle radiation primarily, and I'll explain why. Though there may have been electromagnetic radiation, such as visible light, ultraviolet, or infrared radiation being involved as well. Okay? So where are we? Upper threads. Okay. So the only radiation could transfer the required information from the cloth, from the body to the cloth. That's an interesting aspect of it here. I think it was 6 different ways that information can be transferred from the body to the cloth. That's my paper number 6 on shroudresearch.net. Paper number 5 is on information content on the Shroud of Turin. So paper number 6 goes through the analysis of how the information could have been transferred from the body to the cloth. The conclusion was that only radiation is the only possibility to do that. Let's go on. Why can we see the image? Now that's an interesting question. One of the mysteries was the image. Now, we break that down into two parts. Why can we see the image, and how was the image formed? We break it into two parts because why we can see the image helps us to understand how the image was formed. So why can we see the image? Well, if I held up a black and white photograph here, or a color photograph of a person, why can you see that? Why can you see and identify the person that's on that photograph? Because the information that defines their appearance has been encoded into the position of the pixels that make up the image. That's why you can see it. Same thing applies to the Shroud of Turin. We can see the image on the Shroud of Turin because the information that defines the appearance of a naked crucified man has been encoded into the pattern of discolored fibers that form the image on the shroud. Let's do that again. Why can we see the image? Because the information that defines the appearance of a naked crucified man has been encoded into the pattern of discolored fibers that form the image on the Shroud of Turin. In other words, it's all about information. So how did the information get there? Characteristics of the radiation. Let's go into some of the details that we can learn about this radiation as we follow the evidence where it leads. First of all, this radiation transferred not only the information that was needed to form the image, to control the discoloration mechanism, but it also carried the energy that was needed to drive the discoloration mechanism. Now, the other interesting feature here is that on the image, at the teeth, under the gums, and in the hands, some reports, that also lower part of the backbone and in the skull, they can see bones. See the separation of the bones, even in the skull. I think on a good photograph, I'm not sure if mine are good enough in the back here, but on a good photograph, I think that you really can see teeth below the lips. Now, what does that mean about the radiation? It wasn't just coming from the surface of the body, it was emitted from within the body. To go through the bones, to be altered by the presence of those bones, in order to carry that information to the cloth and deposit that information on the cloth to form the image of the teeth on the image. Just amazing. Now, you realize that there's no there's no lens between the body and the cloth. Now, when you take a picture of a person, whoop, there's a lens in the camera. In order to focus the radiation that's coming off in all different directions, to focus that down onto a plane, either of film or digital material. But there was no lens between the body and the cloth. So how in the world do you form an image from radiation being emitted from within the body? There's only one way. The radiation with a horizontal body, that radiation couldn't be going off like that. It had to be going off like that, vertically collimated, both up and vertically down, in order to form both the front and the back images. It's the only way, as we follow the evidence where it leads. Okay. Now, we found that only the top two fiber layers were discolored. This has led to investigations with lasers on how to form discoloration on linen fibers. And what they found was that you have to use an extremely rapid burst of radiation. In this case, it was either ultraviolet or infrared radiation to form this type of discoloration on linen. So we follow the evidence where it leads. Therefore, we conclude that this pulse of radiation, this radiation that came from the body, occurred in an extremely brief pulse of radiation, extremely intense, extremely brief pulse of radiation. And we also find that only a 0.4 micron discoloration on the fiber means that there was probably a static discharge from the fibers. And if you have a static discharge, for example, if you have a cloud going over, lightning occurs. Do you know what's going on at that event at the instant of the lightning strike? There's huge electrical currents flowing both in the ground and in the cloud to the location of the lightning strike. And so what we believe is that there was a static discharge due to this extremely intense burst of charged particle radiation, which caused the fibers to emit a static discharge from the fibers on the inside of the wrapped configuration that were pointed toward the body, because that's what the evidence is. The image is on the inside of the wrapped configuration. You can tell, based upon where the blood is located, where the inside was versus the outside. The image of the discolored fibers is on the inside of the wrapped configuration. And so then what we believe happened was that there was an extremely high burst of charged particle radiation which created static electrical discharge off the fibers, which created an extreme electrical flow in the fibers. Now, some of you may know, if you have an extremely high electrical flow in a conductor, where in the conductor are those electrons flowing? Anybody know? On the outside, on the circumference. Well, it happens to be that that's exactly where the discoloration occurred on the fibers, just around the outer edge. So that what we think happened, following the evidence where it leads, what was that to form that 0.4 micron discoloration layer, it occurred from one of two sources, maybe a combination. One would be the extremely high electrical current flowing just on the outer circumference of the fibers, causing extreme electron flow and thus extreme heating, and or ozone production, which would then attack just the outside surface of the fibers. Now, this leads to the radiation hypothesis. An extremely rapid, intense burst of radiation was emitted from within the body. That's essentially the radiation hypothesis. Charged particles in this radiation burst cause static discharge from the high points of the fibers. Electrical heating and ozone cause the discoloration of those fibers. The radiation, there's something called radiation pressure. Now, you know that if you can move something by hitting it. Same thing for radiation. If radiation hits something, it can move it. Both particles and electromagnetic radiation, such as visible light, infrared, ultraviolet light, they all carry momentum. So that if that momentum is transferred to an object, it can move it. So the concept here is that in an extremely rapid, extremely intense burst of radiation from within the body, what effect would that have on the blood on the surface of the body? It would thrust it off the body, and if it's vertically collimated radiation, it would accelerate it vertically away from the body onto and into the shroud. And that's what we see. So one by one, can you hold your questions till afterwards? I don't want to be, we'll have time, I think, afterwards. So that radiation pressure caused the blood transfer from the body to the cloth, and neutron absorption, because in this burst of radiation, you realize our bodies are made up of organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of organic molecules, which are made up of atoms, which are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay? So if we have a burst of radiation from the body, what kind of materials are available to compose that burst of radiation? Well, you certainly have to say protons, neutrons, and electrons. So if we say charged particles created the image, well, you have plenty of protons and electrons. Have you ever calculated how many protons and electrons you have in your body? I bet you haven't. I have, okay? There's 2 times 10 to the 28th. 2 followed by 28 zeros would be the number approximately of the number of protons or the number of electrons in the weight of a 170-pound person. Okay, the number of neutrons is about the same. So there's plenty of neutrons. How many neutrons would be needed to be emitted from the body to create the carbon-14 shift in the data, to shift the carbon-14 dating from 33 AD to 1260 AD? I calculated that. That's 2 times 10 to the 18th. 2 followed by 18 zeros. Now that may sound like a very large number of neutrons. But when you compare that with the number in the body, it's only 1 neutron in 10 billion. So that if only 1 neutron in 10 billion, every 10 billion that are in the body were released in this radiation event, it would shift the carbon dating from 33 AD to 1260 AD. Now, we'll be going into that further on Saturday, tomorrow. So, is it the image of Jesus? Now, a lot of times people ask this question. I can talk about all these other things, but what they want to know is it the image of Jesus? And sometimes people say, well, you know, we don't have the DNA of Jesus, and we haven't, the blood on the shroud is so old, we've not had a complete genome developed on that blood yet, so there's no really way to tell, but I think there is. There's 4 different criteria that we've developed here today in our discussion. There's 4 different requirements for this individual to help us to identify him. First of all, it was a man who died by crucifixion. And he died by crucifixion exactly as Jesus was crucified, according to the historical text. And number 3, the dead body emitted a burst of radiation while he was wrapped within the cloth. And number 4, that burst of radiation encoded an image on the inside of the linen cloth in which he was wrapped. Now, the way I like to phrase it, if you look through all of our historical documents that we as human beings possess, you can go back as far in history as you want, there's only one person that qualifies for these 4 different criteria in any remote sense, and that is Jesus. So I say that the most reasonable conclusion is that, based on that this really is the image of Jesus. And so that the image that we see on the Shroud of Turin, because it is totally unique, there's no other burial cloth with an image like this. And even if you took a person and just tried to crucify him, even in Jerusalem, just the way Jesus was, you would not get an image, because it requires a burst of radiation from inside the body. So that because this is a totally unique phenomenon, front and back image of a crucified man on a piece of cloth, that existed in 1355 to 56. It's a totally unique event that caused this totally unique phenomenon. And that was the result, the image of the face. Any questions? Question?
So truly, on an artistic standpoint, if the shroud is made flat, how is the image not distorted if it was wrapped around the face?
Okay, that's the one thing I haven't talked about. That's the one mystery that I haven't fully solved yet. Yes, what he's referring to, on the front, the facial view, if the cloth was indeed wrapped around the face like this, and even if, in my explanation, if there was a vertically collimated burst of radiation, that the image, when you unwrap it, should be much wider, but it's not. So it evident, and there's indication of that on the back image as well, so that we don't show the wrapping effects. There are 2 different explanations that I'm familiar with. One explanation is that perhaps the burial ointments were in the form of flowers in like a long tube, like a long pillow or something, a pillowcase, a long tube placed on either side of the body so that the cloth across the face was relatively flat. Okay, that's one explanation. That's the explanation that Giulio Fonte, a shroud researcher in Italy, gives. Now, my alternate explanation, and I'm not sure which is correct here, is that perhaps the electrostatic effects of my explanation could elevate the top based upon the artistic appearance of the image as we see it, that there was no wrapping either of the front or the back. So that the body was elevated over the cloth. So that even the body doesn't, some parts of the body don't indicate the flattening that you would expect to see. Now, maybe that was from rigor mortis, I'm not sure. But that's being worked on, okay? So there's no certain explanation on that yet. Any other questions? Yes? Yes, there's been various different attempts to recreate something like the image. The very best product of the face came out just a few months ago from a researcher that was using a infrared laser called a femtosecond laser. Now, a femtosecond is 10 to the minus 15th second. Now, that would be a radiation burst which would last a millionth of a second. And he used that laser, and he produced a very good image of the face. But he combined that with one important element, and that was information to control it. And that's exactly what I'm saying here. It was created by radiation controlled by information. So it's a confirmation of what I'm saying. Okay. Yes? Blood question. I would think it would. Ron Wyatt makes all kinds of fantastic claims, and I'm not sure what to make of them. That might be a good way to say it. I'm just not sure what to make of them. Yes, the blood is male, but as to how many chromosomes, I wouldn't. You realize Jesus was a real human being, so that it wouldn't surprise me if he had normal chromosomes. Okay? Yes, go ahead. That the flax? Yes, there's been some report of them seeing the hairline cracks or the joining points of the various sections of the skull. Question? There's no paint pigment. There's real blood on the shroud, yes. There's real blood. It's been tested, I don't know, 12 or 16 different ways as to whether it's human or not, and it's passed all of those tests as being human blood. Those tests don't necessarily exclude every other animal, but every test that they've been able to do is consistent with it being human blood. Yes? Yes.
This color. Did the shielding of the fiber affect both sides? So were both sides healed in this color, or was one side more than the other? Full round discoloration.
That needs further investigation. I think in places it went all the way around. Maybe not toward the edges of the discoloration. The start and end of the discoloration may not have gone all the way around, but that needs to be further investigated. Okay. Question? What about coins on the eyes? Yes, that's. I list 14 different ways, and I'll mention some of them tomorrow. 14 different date indicators have been recognized for the Shroud of Turin. It's not just carbon dating. There's 14 different options. 13 of the date indicators are consistent with the 1st century and contradict the carbon dating. One of those is the possibility of a coin being over one eye. There's some reports of another coin being over the other eye. but over the one eye, after extensive enhancement of the images, they can see what they believe to be 3, possibly 4 different letters up at the 11 o'clock position, which would identify that coin as a Roman lepton, which would be minted by Pontius Pilate between 29 and 32 AD. Now, some people doubt that. They think that it's really just the result of our enhancement of the image, and that you stop enhancing it once you get what you want. I tend to think that it's real. Okay? Any other questions?
Yeah, there was I don't remember the research today, but literally showed the image of black that was on crucified person's chest, and that 3 Hebrew letters that spelled out the lamb. Have you heard anything about that?
That spelled. And that was supposed to be found on the Shroud of Turin? Okay. There's often evidence that's come out like that. And a lot of times we have to just wait and see on further information like that. And there's a lot of things are claimed to be found in the image, whether it's a plaque, something around the neck, chain attached to the head, which shows movement, thus indicating multiple radiation pulses. These are all possibilities that need to be further investigated that we've heard of. Okay, and we're kind of taking a wait and see attitude on that. Okay. Yes. Nothing. Just a laser. That'd be the only option. In other words, what we're talking about, what we've done here is we've followed the evidence where it leads. And what we've come up with is that from a dead crucified body, there has been an extremely rapid, think in the terms of milliseconds or maybe even microsecond range, extremely rapid, extremely intense burst of radiation to form the radiation that formed the image, probably charged particles, had to be vertically collimated. So realize that we're talking about something that's outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. That's the way that I say it. Okay? Now, that's the way I lead it. So I'm approaching this in a scientific fashion. So I'm just saying that we're talking about something that is outside or beyond our current understanding of the laws of physics. Yes? Question? Yes, the History Channel has the best one out on that. Oh, well, that's true. That's basically taking the three-dimensional information that's on the shroud, and then they work back how a cloth would be draped over body to determine the vertical separation between the body and the cloth. And based upon that information for every point on the body, they then relate that to the density of the image on the shroud in order to create a statue. Okay? So that, yes, that's one of the features of the Shroud of Turin. It contains three-dimensional information related to the vertical distance between the body and the cloth at each point.
And that goes along with what you're talking about, the gradation of the colors, or the gradation from Dr. Matt was talking about, from the nose, like what you were saying, from the nose to here, that wrapping stuff. So we're using that, the deterioration of radiation.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I followed your question. You know, the radiation is diminishing as it travels vertically due to absorption, scattering, and possibly even decay. So that it gets weaker as it travels that vertical distance. So that for vertical distances over about 3 or 4 centimeters, about that far, there's no discoloration. Yes, question?
In John 27, it says the handkerchief that had been around his head
Yes. Yes, it's in Oviedo, Spain. The Greek word is sudarium. I didn't mention it. I will mention it on tomorrow's presentation. The sudarium of Oviedo, the Greek word is sudarium. Sudarium is translated either face cloth or head cloth. Could be translated either way. And this was an item that was put onto his head after he dies. They climbed up and they wrapped it around his head to catch the blood that was coming out of his nose and his mouth in order to bury that blood with his body. Because in Jewish culture, the life is in the blood, Leviticus says, interpreted to mean that the soul is in the blood. Okay? So they have to bury the blood. On television, years ago, I saw there was some type of an event where someone was blown up. The ladies were out on the cobblestone street, sopping up the blood on the cobblestone street in order to bury it with the person. Okay? So that the headcloth would be put on, headcloth or face cloth, would be put on. It was actually put on part way. His head was evidently over. It couldn't be put all the way over. So they had to double it back. So the pattern on the sudarium of Oviedo correlates well with the Shroud of Turin, except it doubles back. But it's the same type of blood, AB male, high in bilirubin, and we didn't get to that, but that's an evidence of extreme damage to red blood cells, as would occur with flogging. Of course, a forger or an artist would not know to put bilirubin into the blood in 1355. Of course. So, you draw your own conclusions here, but I know what my conclusion is. Yes. Okay, did that add one more? Or? Yes, the distance between the body cloth has just been determined experimentally by draping cloth over people. Okay. There were other parts to your question. What were some of the other parts to your question?
Could we reproduce an image with the technology to have like a full one that would look like this one?
No, okay. The technology to make this image has never existed. Has never existed in the past. Does not exist today. Now, with laser technology and computer technology, you might be able to get close to it. But see, in my concept, it wasn't produced by a laser emitting infrared, visible, or ultraviolet light. It was primarily charged particles. So in my concept, what you'd have to control would be charged particles to create an extremely rapid single burst of this radiation to create the static discharge off the fibers so that the result of heating and production of ozone could then create the discoloration. All that has to be explained. Okay? Question?
My question is, was there some kind of oil perfume or involved with the
They did. As far as can be determined from the experiments that have been done so far, and realize that the Shroud of Turin is not just open to anyone that wants to go there and do experiments on it. The only time in history that it's been thoroughly investigated was 1978. Not before, not since. But we're trying to get a second try at a serious investigation of the Shroud of Turin, hopefully in 2025. Okay, when it goes on display. Question? Inverse square law doesn't apply if you have collimated radiation. The diminishing of the intensity of the radiation basically falls off fairly linearly with distance. Now you can take a laser, and with a powerful laser you can point it at the moon, and you can see it on the spot on the moon that it hasn't spread out much. Okay, so that, in other words, the inverse square law doesn't apply to any kind of collimated radiation. But you're welcome to talk with me afterwards, and please look at things on the back table. Books. Thank you.